Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're going to continue our conversation about how our brain works and why our brain matter matters. Part 2. This is Troy Faddis, licensed marriage and family therapist.
And this is Dr. Maddy Liebing, psychologist and marriage and family therapist. And we're just happy to be here today.
All right. Should we do a little refresher from last time?
Yeah, let's do. I'm just going to kind of run through these parts again. Remember, we talked about last week that our limbic system is kind of the emotional and reward system. It has rules, our brain does, to protect and conserve energy. And that when things are tough or stressful, we automatically and directly go to the limbic system. And I think we talked about the fact that that's part of the paranervous system and in the body, and it's not just in the head, it goes all the way through your body. And that's why you can feel emotions in different parts of your body and why they get stuck there, especially in stressful times like trauma. And it's really the gas pedal of the brain. It goes fast. It's the quickest way to deal with something. It uses less energy, and we just go there really quickly. And especially our young adults and children, because their cortex, which is on the top end of the brain, frontal lobes, are not developed very well until you're in the mid-20s. And that part of the brain uses really the brake pedal. It's where it says, wait, let's think about this. Let's slow this down. Let's, process what's going to be, the right thing to do, the judgment center. And it uses a lot more energy to do that. And so instead, when we slide into the limbic system, we have those responses that we have for stress or for trauma, which is fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. And it also has to do with relationships. To protect, to belong. We need to feel significant to others. We need to have relationships and just connect. And that's some of those needs that are also solutions to some of the problems when we end up finding ourselves in the limbic system a lot. But
I we talk about like the cortex and how it doesn't develop until their mid-20s.
Yeah.
I think that's actually where a lot of our fights with our children come from now, because if you look like 50 years ago, maybe it was 100, but probably like 50, 60, 70 years ago, we had a cultural difference in that children had to prove their value to parents, but today we as parents have to prove our value to our children. And we're doing that as they get into their mid-20s, like their early 20s and mid-20s, when their prefrontal cortex is no longer developed. I think generations past, they had different experiences that developed it a little bit faster. Today, it's not so much. Cultural change has happened. And so as we as parents, I think we're trying to be the prefrontal cortex for our children.
Yeah, and a lot of times when we're having a difficult conversation with our child, we'll be operating from the cortex, trying to help them to see and understand and problem solve and slow things down. And they're operating from the limbic system, which is freeze and flight, and I don't want to talk to you, and I'm getting out of here, and I don't want to hear this, and they're getting all emotional and all of the things that are happening. And so it's like that two parts of the brain is trying to have a conversation with each other. It's not going to work. And neither the cortex is going to be happy about it, nor is the limbic system going to be happy.
Well, and I know this merging like neuroscience and brain development with developmental theory, but it's like we're trying to be the prefrontal cortex for our kids when they're trying to do this stage of autonomy. And so I think that's where a lot of our fights are occurring. They want their autonomy and let me do what I'm going to do. And we want to be their prefrontal cortex and save them from making big mistakes.
And it seems so logical to us.
Right.
This was okay. How would you possibly think this was okay? And yet for them, it's completely logical because they're operating completely. in the limbic realm, and at the same time trying to be independent. So they're being independent with half a brain. That sounds,
Mhm.
but it's part of what's happening, and that's why part of what we're doing is trying to get them to slow things down and be able to
Yeah.
operate, in that cortex range.
Yeah, well, I don't think we said much about it last time, but that I put some of the neurotransmitters and the hormones that affect our brain. And maybe sometimes we may be in our cortex, but we're also still flooded with the cortisol because we're distressed for them.
Mm-hmm. Right. And sometimes you're interacting with the testosterone.
Yes, right. Or the dopamine surges that they're trying to use is why they're using.
True. And so some of those things that are listed there for fight, flight, freeze, protect, belong, sometimes we end up, using substances in order to be able to deal with um, the pain of being in the limbic system, of experiencing all these stresses and emotions and everything that's going on. And so what I wanted to show you is a couple of slides about how drugs work in people's brains. And you can Google this. What you're looking for, if you want to Google it yourself and look at it, is they're called functional MRIs. And they're taking a picture, basically looking straight down on the top of the brain. So you can see the left hemisphere, the right hemisphere, looking straight down. On the left-hand side, what happens with these functional MRIs is that what they're taking pictures of and using colors to demonstrate is brain activity. It's how much electrical activity is going on inside the brain. So in a healthy brain, right there in that core part of their brain, you can see there's green and then orange and then, yellow and then orange. The orange and the yellows and the greens are more active electrical responses that are happening in the brain. When someone's using drugs, it basically shuts down that electrical system, and the drug or the whatever they're taking takes the place of the body producing the chemicals and the electrical stimulation that's needed to make the brain function. Go ahead and show us the next one. Right. So this is a healthy control on the left-hand side. You can see lots of orange and yellow and green just on both sides of the brain, and just doing a good job. The one in the middle is a month after abstinence. So you can see there's almost no orange and just a little bit of yellow. And then the one on the right this is from a methamphetamine user, 14 months after abstinence. So you can see it's almost back to the same. That's 14 months of abstinence. So what we learned from this is the plasticity of the brain is that it can heal, and we can get back to where we were before, but it takes a long time for that to happen, and it requires abstinence to make that happen. Has to just heal itself, basically. And so here's the hard thing for someone who's trying to stay clean and sober. So say they're a month or two into sobriety, their brain is still not functioning quite right, and there's this it's kind of dulled out, and the brain's going, oof. It's like when you're hungry, it's like, oof, I need something. I'm, there's not enough energy here, not enough electrical stimulation going on in here. And unfortunately, the brain goes, oh, I know what we can do about that. I know how to get instantaneous energy inside this space that's feeling really empty. And that's using the drug again. And that's why relapses are so prevalent, because there's a part of you that's going, I can fix this in a heartbeat. Well, a few minutes anyway. And it's hard for the person to tell that part of the brain, you're just going to have to be like this, and you're going to have these post-acute withdrawal symptoms, which are anxiety and anger and depression and sleeplessness. And if we try to medicate some of those things, you can use antidepressants and stuff, but it still just takes time for the brain to actually heal. And so what we're trying to do is get to that 12 is kind of a magical time, but 14 months of abstinence to have the brains to be able to regenerate and be able to be healthy again.
But in a future webinar, we'll do the 9 lifestyle things that people who remain sober do. Mm-hmm. And time sober is one of those 9. And the research is clear. Like, I think they gravitate towards 12 months because that's the average across the substances that we've researched. But some substances like meth, also the method of delivery, like IV use versus smoking,
Mhm.
some of those things have a longer recovery time for the brain to heal and for those neurons, the neuroplasticity, to regrow.
That's why during that 12-month period, you need extra support. You need to have a strong recovery community. You need to have a therapist. You need to have people who are helping you to be able to help your brain to do what it needs to do to be able to heal. And that's why
Yep.
a lot of programs end up being around between the primary care, and we're going to talk about this next week, and the transitional programs about a year.
Yep.
But that's why.
Yep.
Okay, let's go back to the brain again. Sure. Oh, wait, do we have any questions? This is going to be where we'll ask questions, but in this recorded one, we won't. So we'll just have to do that in another one. But so going back to the brain, we wanted to talk a little bit more about the director and the monitor.
Yeah. So the director or monitor, as I said last time, it's a bit of a psychological construct, meaning it's not like an identifiable spot like the limbic system or the cortex. But we know that it operates and that it helps it directs traffic to the cortex and to the limbic system. The monitor is a little bit more sensitive towards goals, where the director is trying to keep us safe, like fight, flight, or freeze, or is trying to get solutions, like sending it to the cortex. The monitor wants to know if we are being successful. And they're always constantly running. They're always in the background giving us nudges one way or the other. And because the director likes to have a script, it likes to have a program, that there is a couple of things that we have found that the director becomes more sensitive to. And in his book, Your Brain at Work, David Rock has organized those things into an acronym that he calls SCARF, SCARF. And depending on our experiences in life and our genetics and epigenetics, we have a set point of how sensitive we are to each of these things. So we can become hyper aroused to any of the 5 scarfs, or we can have what would be considered a normal reaction to them, but we all have them. And that's why when we have trauma, sometimes we're more aroused to these things, and particularly when we've, it's like having an emotional sunburn. When something has burnt you and they touch your shoulder and you recoil, the same thing can happen with the scarf model. And here are the scarf model. The first is our status. And, we all think like we all have a certain need. Like one of our basic instincts is to feel significant. And we all want to create a community of people around us that help us feel significant in some way. And when that status is taken away, whether like like I remember when I was younger, my parents were adopting siblings. And at one point in time, we were looking at adopting some girls, and I was the oldest. And if we adopted her, she would become the oldest. I would lose my status as the oldest born in the family. And I remember thinking about that and being, oh, what does that mean? Is that something I'm threatened by or not? So status is something our brain is paying careful attention to. The second is certainty. Even though we are hardwired to like some novelties, like we always want something that's a little bit different, but we all want the things that we expect. So like, for example, everyone wants to have, this might date me, an iPod. I guess now it just would be your phone or your iPhone. You know, which iPhone do you want? Do you have the iPhone 10, or do you need to have the iPhone 11 with all 3 cameras? But back when it was iPods, everyone had just one choice: white. But when they came out with black iPods, ooh, that was, everyone wanted black, because the certainty of having this item, of knowing it was going to be there, that you could listen to your music, but to have the novel part of it just a little bit is how we're wired. But we all want things to be sort of certain in our life. Like certain this person's going to be there when I come home. Certain that I get to watch the TV I want to have. I remember reading a book once. The analogy that they had was one of the daughters was really reactive, and she could not handle changes. And there were so many Lego waffles in the freezer. And she had counted them out, and she decided how many that she could have each day, to have at least one every day for breakfast for the whole week. Well, one day her brother came in, opened the package, and took a bunch. And she flipped out because it questioned her certainty. Like, I knew I was going to have a waffle for tomorrow, and you ate the ones I was going to have for tomorrow. And her brother had no idea, but her hypersensitivity to the lack of certainty is what triggered her. Third is autonomy. And that's what I meant earlier. Like, it was developmentally, we all want to. We get to a stage, particularly, where we're seeking autonomy. And as we're seeking autonomy, we're looking to differentiate, make our own choices, have people, our parents, respect those choices and not always disagree with them. And the more that need for autonomy is threatened or restricted, or perception that it's restricted, the more our scarf or our director is going to have a reaction to our limbic system or to our cortex. Relationships. We all have a hardwired need to belong, and that, like, belong in an emotional, like the need to, the want to be wanted. And also, we're all hardwired for reproduction. And those two things sometimes get confused, maybe particularly for men, but they are actually separate. Is that relationship is the need to have someone who really deeply cares about us, that we fit with our visions, our goals, our Dr. Gottman calls it the sound marital house, and that we're feeling supported in our passions by another person. And then the last one is fairness. Our monitor really is keyed into this, especially if we've been hurt or questioned, or we think that sometimes we're born situations, because life often is not fair, where we have a mentality of a deficiency mindset versus having a mentality of an abundance mindset. And it's easy for us to be wired to look for what is fair, what is mine, and what is unfair. And a lot of times that's directed inward, it is, but not always. Sometimes people become great advocates for the underdog because they are too wired, maybe even hyper wired, to pay attention to fairness with themselves and in the world. In fact, it's actually one of the developmental stages that we hit 16, 17, 18, is that we get hyper focused on social justice because of this wiring and us trying to figure out how to navigate fairness in the world. I'm realizing I'm sort of crossing over to developmental theory a lot today, aren't I?
Right. And you hear that a lot, teenagers and young adults, is that's just not fair. And at the same time, what's interesting about that sometimes is that fair can sometimes bleed over into being entitled. Like for some kids, it's not fair that I don't get a Ferrari, or it's not fair that I don't get a car, and so what is fair, if we look at it from the standpoint of the anatomy of peace, it's being treated like a person and not being like an object. and we can boil it down to fairly simple terms. But unfortunately, our society is so we have so much privilege and accessibility to wonderful blessings that then kids begin to think that that's what they deserve. Like, it's not fair that I don't get to do soccer and piano and whatever. I mean, I don't like piano, but just a whole bunch of different things because my friend does. The guy down the block here does, or my friend's parents let him pot it at their house. And so this fairness can get pretty distorted as part of sometimes when we start getting into that entitled range. So what we wanted to talk about is heart at peace conversations. Some of the things that you put in our evaluations was, how do we stay out of that negative cycle? How can we have these difficult conversations with our son or daughter? And how can we, through these conversations and getting out of the box, be able to be in a more adult-to-adult relationship, operating more out of the cortex instead of just out of the limbic system? And how can we be able to let that my son or daughter feel like they're really being seen, which helps them in being able to feel like they're having a reciprocal relationship, and hopefully calming some of those things in the scarf model that get elevated or escalated when they feel like those things aren't happening for them. And one of the things that we use a ton here is reflective listening. And reflective listening is just saying, so what I hear you saying is, the most simple formula is just to say back exactly what the other person said, but it's a little bit more meaningful if you can, add a little bit to it, or, interpret it a little bit, or, just try to make sure that you really get it. But the whole point of reflective listening is that someone says something to you, and your job is not to talk them out of it, to justify it, to try to change their mind, to try to get them on your side, to try to get your point across. All those things are just not there. We just let that go. And it doesn't mean, if you're reflecting what they said, it doesn't mean that you're necessarily agreeing with them. But what you're trying to do is really just hear. And so what you would say back is, so I hear you saying that you're really frustrated because you don't feel like we listen to you, and that you don't have autonomy, and you don't get to try to become an adult. And is that what you said? And then you'd have to say, did I hear you? Did you hear? Did they come anywhere close to what you're trying to say? And give them the opportunity to modify that. Say, no, that's not even close to what I was trying to say. This is what I was trying to say. So then you reflect back until you get to the place where they go, yes, that's exactly what I said. And when you have your son or daughter say, yes, that's what I'm saying, that's when you have arrived. That's when you've gotten to the place of really hearing what they're trying to say. And that changes the dialogue, because then, even if you don't agree with them, they feel heard and they feel seen, and that quiets the limbic, and it quiets the scarf, and gets them to a place where now you can start operating more out of the cortex and be able to move into more discussion.
I was just going to say, as you said that, I reminded of Dr. Scott Stanley and Dr. Howard Markham from the University of Denver. They talk about 3 levels of listening. The first is the content level. The second is the feelings or the emotional level. And the third, I think they call it the hidden meanings. I think I call it the deeper meanings. But being able to reflect all 3. So if you just do the first, the content, you just sound like a parrot. You're just parroting it back to them. But it's really, I think it's about those deeper ones, like really reflecting on the emotional experiences that this person is sharing with you. And Dr. Sue Johnson talks about it in terms of being attuned. Like when someone's attuned to your pain, and they can show that through reflective listening, I think that's back to the neuroscience of all this. Like that activates a mirror neuron of, oh, this person's on, like, again, I clearly probably know they don't agree with me, or not. They're not validating like my bad thoughts or telling me I'm justified, which is why I think a lot of people are afraid of listening, because they're afraid of validating something they believe in. But it's really about being attuned. Like, I want to show you that I can feel the pain too, or that your pain at least matters to me.
And then that's both. Then your son or daughter is both seen and heard, and that creates that connection between the two of you that allows for getting out of the cycle, getting out of the box, and getting out of the negative cycle, but moving into a more reciprocal relationship.
Yeah.
And then, of course,
And
if you ask them to do the same thing, then it's even better, which is what we do in the 4 R's, which is one of the exercises we use at family workshops. Go ahead, try and catch
that's
up.
one of my favorite. I'm glad you said that. The 4 R's. We just need to do one just on the 4 R's. The next one is, I feel like the reflective listening really fits with the next one, which is moving down the influence pyramid. And here's the influence pyramid for all of you who haven't read the book, and I encourage you to please read the book, A Heart at Peace by the Arbinger Institute, because it really talks about how a lot of times, and we're all guilty, I'm guilty, where all of our effort is put here. I mean, so many of us, this is the correction. Like, this learning to correct is where most of our parenting skills lie, and we're dealing with things that are going wrong versus putting most of our effort into helping things go right. And so a lot of times, like when, like reflective listening, they're saying something, but I don't agree with it. My response is to want to correct it. And so instead of listening, I'm actually building my counter argument. I need to listen. And then the next thing we do, if we're trying to like move down, is let me teach them. It's like, I'm sure that if they knew that I was right, and I taught them how right I was, and I communicate really well, they're gonna come on my side. And sometimes we're like surprised when that doesn't work too. But I think that the real power of things like reflective listening or attunement comes because we're building the relationship. You know, when they recognize that I really can like respond appropriately to their hurt, not just try to fix it for them. I think us as dads, we really get into this problem of wanting to fix things for everybody. And sometimes we need to, but most of the time we don't. Most of the time what people really want is, how do I build a relationship?
And I think that's where you seek to understand, is that's where you go into the, let me just really understand. Okay, so, okay, you can feel a person getting escalated. You see, stuff kind of getting out of control. Like, whoa, help me understand. Tell me again. Let me try to hear better what you're trying to say. And that's the seek to understand, and that builds the relationship, and that's deeper in the pyramid. And that's why because it's bigger, you should do more of that than you do of the correct. That's why it's a pyramid.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes it's been like there's been hurt, enough trauma that even in our best efforts to build a relationship it's not helping regain the trust. And at those times, it's really helpful to find what relationship does, like my son, my daughter, my spouse, my boss, who do they have a relationship with that they do trust? And can I help use the trust in those relationships to help us get to a place where we can see each other more as people instead of seeing each other in an objectified way. That only works if we truly are out of the box.
Mm-hmm.
If we're doing it just to, in fact, I forgot names, but the couple who did is a marital program called Couples Communication, the Millers, Dr. and Dr. Miller. They had a chart at the beginning of their workshop where it talked about one axis was skills and the other axis was caring. And what would happen if someone had a lot of skill at communicating, but they didn't care? And the only thing that did is they made them a better manipulator. And so for moving down the pyramid, like I'm trying to build a relationship with others who have influence, but I don't really care about the person, my heart's at war, I'm just doing it to win, or I'm just doing it to get my way, then really all I'm really doing is I'm still objectifying that person. So for this really to work, I ultimately have to have a heart at peace, and I'm seeing the person, their pains, their worries, their fears is equal to my own. And I don't see the other person as a problem a vehicle to be used, or irrelevant.
So another way to try to get your heart at peace and get out of the box is what we do a lot of here is mindfulness. Mindfulness is really interesting because basically, if we can bring ourselves into the present, if we can notice the five senses that we experience and use those five senses to access our environment, what's interesting is it quiets the brain. Our brain sometimes is just going so fast and it's just ruminating and it's going around and around, and we're worried about the past and we're fearful of the future and we're not in the present at all. And what mindfulness does is brings us into the now. And that can be something as simple as smelling a flower or touching a rock or petting a horse or a dog. Dogs, that's why dogs are so powerful, because they help us be mindful and be in the present. Sitting around a campfire, smelling the food or smelling the fire itself. All of those kinds of things are mindfulness. And what happens is when we can quiet our minds in this way, our minds and our brains and our pain can naturally heal, because it's not, all the energy isn't being used in about 150 different directions. And so there are some specific ways that you can do some of this mindfulness. One of them, and we use this for specifically, we use it for trauma, but it works with all these, any kind of mindfulness and trying to kind of calm the brain down, is what's called bilateral stimulation. In EMDR, it's either following a finger back and forth, and there's a process that you use that in, or holding buzzers in your hand and one buzzes and then the other. But some of the most effective bilateral stimulation is just movement, walking, for example. And if you're using walking sticks, actually moving your arms at the same time. Any kind of our workout machines, the glider, the step machine, even just just running. But what happens is that for some reason, when we're doing bilateral stimulation, where we're doing something on one side of our body and then the other side of the body in a rhythmic way, back and forth, it helps to equalize the energy in between our brains, and it also releases a lot of the tension. Sort of like REM sleep. When we're sleeping and we have dreams, our eyes go back and forth, and it's doing the same thing. And what dreams do a lot of times is release the tension of the day, so that we can reprocess and be ready, for the next day. And so that's one type of mindfulness. There's other kinds of mindfulness too, but one kind that I'm going to encourage everybody to do is to get out and walk. If I know that this is one of the problems with being in our homes right now, is that we can use, maybe you have an exercise machine in your home and you can get that bilateral stimulation, but you need to move, and you need to move in a bilateral way. That's another reason why equine therapy works. Riding horses is bilateral stimulation, because your body is moving back and forth, from one side to the other, and it helps the healing of the brain in that process. I know that you want to add something to that too, though. Troy, you had a fun experience yesterday with some bilateral stimulation.
Well, I've learned a long time ago that bilateral stimulation when I'm out hiking helps me a lot, and particularly recently I've started using hiking poles, and that it made it so much more deliberate, in that I was constantly using the motion of my left and my right, and I've become very deliberate again about taking a 20-minute time where I'm going to go and I'm going to think about a thought or about an emotion or about an experience. Usually it's about something I'm struggling with, and then it can be a positive experience too. But I know for me, I get a lot of benefit by thinking about something that I'm maybe stuck on. And I will spend 20 minutes deliberately thinking about it and noticing as I go back and forth and back. So I did this yesterday, Maddie's saying, is I went for a hike, and I had some worries and fears of COVID right now, and there's a lot of things that are changing, and my children are growing up and getting into new phases of their lives. And so I was just thinking about lots of things, and I thought about some specific things, and I used my hiking poles, and I hiked high into the mountains. As high, I haven't been this high this year because the snow is finally starting to melt. And as I was climbing this mountain, I paused and I just recognized that my mind had not just taken taken myself into a different direction, but I found myself feeling really peaceful. When I started, I had a lot of anxiety. But by the time, and I didn't even like it was just like a moment. I stopped. I literally stopped and went, oh, I just noticed the peace. And I think that had a lot to do with the bilateral. And actually, it was so profound. I actually pulled my phone out and I did a little recording of the force of bilateral stimulation. And I'll do like a 5-minute video, and I'll share that video with you guys on the YouTube channel here in a little bit.
Yeah, and so avail yourself of that opportunity, but any kind of mindfulness. And that's one of the reasons why green space in the cities is so important, because when you're doing any kind of mindfulness activity, you're allowing yourself to just be in the moment and be in that space. And 5 senses really help with that. You can emphasize one sense at a time, like the smell or music does that. It's for the sense of hearing or listening to birds in the trees. Taste, that's one of the reasons why food becomes so important, because when you're in the middle of taking that bite and savoring that flavor of whatever it is that you're eating, then you're right here. You're mindful and you're in the present. So all of those things, make sure that you're getting all of those things happening, and know that we're doing those things with your sons and daughters. That's one of the reasons why we hike, because it's bilateral stimulation, and you're carrying a backpack and you're hiking around. So that's one of the things. And then the EFT, I'm going to switch over to Troy, but we've talked mostly about this, so we're just going to kind of just remember.
Yeah. I was about to say, I probably should take the EFT part off, because we did a whole podcast on do you know your cycle and how to step out of your cycle and avoiding past patterns. But relating it to this topic of neuroscience, I just say that, we are all hardwired to need relationships. And when our most important relationships are under distress, our brain is wired to be reactive to that. And sometimes the reactions that we have get us into an unhealthy pattern. And so, like, really going back and practicing, do you know your pattern? And trying to step out of it. Not trying to, and I said shame here, not using shame, but it's really shame, power, or any type of intense reaction that's intended to force the other person back into a relationship with you. Is like we're forcing a homeostatic pattern by having a positive or negative feedback loop. I just got way too sciencey there. But it's better just to acknowledge the way that I'm reacting, because this is important to me. But it's also important to acknowledge that they're reacting probably the opposite of us for the same reason, because they too are trying to protect, not just protect themselves, protect the relationship. And other approaches like cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, and acceptance commitment therapy are all modalities from the same sort of main parent of CBT. They talk about being able to disobey the reactions that you're prompted to have. If I can, let me just move up real quick. If I can, as I'm having an experience, emotional or cognitive, say, wow, I'm in this brain, or I'm in this brain. Just like acknowledging it instantly gives you some power. And it gives even more power if you give this part of your brain a name. And if you give this part of your brain a name, it could be silly, it could be whatever. Like, maybe it's a person in your life who's always reactive. They're always in their midbrain. That way, that name has meaning for you. You're like, oh, there's Uncle Bob. Uncle Bob was always reactive. Be able to say, I'm going, like, you can acknowledge it. Like, don't try to shame it or say like, get out of my life, because they will always be there and they'll always be protective. Actually, it's like, thank you for protecting me. I appreciate what you're trying to do. I really do. And I'm going to disobey you right now. I'm going to do the next right thing, even though you want me to do something different. And Dr. Hayes actually has written a really good blog on some of these techniques of giving it a name, acknowledging its protective power, and disobeying it.
And that's one of the ways to get out of the cycle, to step out of the cycle and get out of the box.
Yep.
Another one is self-care and lifestyles. And I know you've heard this over and over and over, so it's not anything new. There's a fun book called The Depression Cure. And this fellow did research with college students and found that there were certain elements that if they changed a lifestyle to make sure that these were balanced in their lives, their depression was significantly reduced, and for some clients was completely gone. And he's not, saying that you never have to have any kind of depression medication, but for most, like 70%, I can't remember the actual statistics, they didn't need medication anymore, or the medication was much less by doing these things. Now, and these are the things that he found in the research. Engaging activity, something that gets you engaged and you're interested in, and you're moving and you're doing stuff, and it engages mind and body. Physical exercise, which we already know. Sunlight, just being in the sun, being outdoors, which is one of the things I worry about when people are, supposed to stay home all the time, is that the sunlight is important. This sunlight exposure, 20 minutes a day, even if it's a hot day, it still works. Social support, we talked about over and over. We're hardwired for connection, and we need that social support. And then sleep, which is making sure that we get enough sleep every night. And nutrition, but especially including omega-3 vitamins. And so it's interesting that our wilderness programs have all of those things: engaging activities, adventures, physical exercise every day, lots of sunlight exposure, social support in the community that they're operating in here in the wilderness program. Sleep is a little questionable. Most people get so they sleep pretty well, but sometimes it's a little hard because you're sleeping on the ground. And then,
but we're back in our circadian rhythms. Like we're going to bed with the sun, we're waking up with the sun. And I find that some people, not always, but most people actually learn to sleep more comfortably outside than they do indoors.
They do.
I know. Yeah, go ahead.
The time I did like a 40-day, wilderness experience myself, one of them. And when I got back home, I couldn't sleep inside. I had to sleep outside. And I did have that, need to be able to get to sleep as soon as, not long after it got dark, and be up when it was light. Anyway, but good sleep. And then we do a lot of, good nutrition. We don't necessarily give everyone omega-3 vitamins. That's the one that we don't do on a regular basis. Some of our clients take that because they were taking it when they came in. But anyway, the point is that as you develop a lifestyle that has these components, you will be more healthy, and you will be better able to take care of yourself, and by doing that, have more capacity to keep yourself out of the box when you get into your relationships with people.
And then I think was it last week or 2 weeks ago? 2 weeks ago, we talked about the what did you call it, Maddy? The parenting change diagram.
Change parenting. Mm-hmm.
And I talked about some of those studies that looked at parents who had high influence on their older adolescents, and a lot of those things that they found was attuning and putting emphasis on the relationship, but also having non-negotiable boundaries, and being able to be unified as a parental unit on set some of those boundaries, and then using that parenting change diagram. I know, Maddy, you're an expert at that change diagram. I'll just share real quick.
Well, yeah, it's just the idea of having a balance between developing relationship and boundaries. If we're too much on the boundary side, we're more authoritarian and we get more rebellion. If we're too much on the relationship side, we're just being a friend, and we're not providing the kind of clarity and safety that comes from having clear boundaries. We talk about a lot of times when I'm training horses. is you have a round pen, and it's round so they don't get caught in the corner and they don't get hurt. But a lot of times what you do, you just let the horse run, just help them move. But you have a clear boundary. They're not going to go outside of this space, and they're going to be safe in that space. And that safety, it makes it possible for me as the trainer to create a relationship with the horse, so then the horse begins to do what I ask them to without touching them. When we develop that relationship, because there's boundaries, there's movement, and that can develop a relationship between the two of us.
As you're working with therapists and doing some of your therapy at home, which I really, if you're not, the research is clear that when families are doing treatment for themselves or as a couple and doing family therapy, that the progress that their child makes while they're in residential treatment is increased. And so we talk about some of these things, if you notice, like maybe to the, how do I address charged topics, like the ones that we've always had buttons around, being able to do some of our own work and then doing some family therapy work can help us begin to work on the things that have historically been a fight and do it in a way that we're not fighting. And so some of the modalities you might want to use is like mindfulness practices, EMDR, brain spotting, CBT or DBT or ACT, neurofeedback, and the more of these type of things that you're seeking and engaging in, the more likely the progress that your son is going to make will be faster here, or your daughter, but also more likely it's going to stick. Yeah, thank you all for joining us again. Remember, please subscribe, push the notification button, share these webinars with people, and as Maddy said, get out there this week.
Get outside. Get outside. All right. Thank you so much.
Stay healthy. Stay safe. Thank you all.